Hey, we're live.
Hello.
How's everybody doing? We had
Hello,
a
everyone.
we had a brief break, which was fantastic, and I think I enjoyed my time off last month. But this particular Data Fundamentals Unpacked, I've been looking forward to for a really long time. I'd like to welcome Stacey Gordon to our party. Stacey is focused on improving workplace cultures. She has a mission to reduce bias in the global talent acquisition and management space. She's also a fellow LinkedIn instructor and has been known for having the top course in the library about bias. And so we are so happy that she's here with us today. And she's just recently released Unbiased, which is addressing unconscious bias at work. And you can follow her and find links to that and learn from her. So let's just all welcome Stacey to Data Fundamentals Unpacked. We're so happy
Thank you.
to have you uh, with us. So one of the things that we always do is we try to unpack a fundamental concept, and then we also try to talk about timely and timeless topics. And I think data and talking about bias is not only something we need to unpack, but it also serves that timeless and timely information as well. So really just to kick us off, well, first of all, Bill and Jeannie, wave and say hello to our crowd here.
Hello, everyone.
We might also want to point out that there are comments in the chat with links, and none of those are from us.
Yes. And
Let's wave and say hello to everybody except for the spammers who will say goodbye to. Go away.
Yeah, which is really interesting because now in the comment structure, I see myself posting as a spammer. So I hope
exactly.
I hope that's true anyway. There's really not a whole lot we can do about that.
But if we post something, we'll let you know we're doing it, okay?
Yes. For me, I'm never going to post "We are live now, join fast." So in case you're curious if that's actually me or not, it is not. It is not me. So we'll try not to be distracted by that. But Stacey, I think it's really important before we really get in deep into this conversation that you share with us the definition of bias, because I think that can be very, very impactful to like begin the conversation, just to let people know what do we even mean. So I'll turn it over to you and ask you to define bias for us.
Thank you. Well, the interesting thing about speaking of LinkedIn and spammers, right? Being a LinkedIn instructor, we get a lot of comments and emails and things in our in-mail accounts. And I had someone challenge me on the title, right? Because I used the phrase unconscious bias, and it's not like I made this up. Like it's literally science, right? I am not a scientist, so the concept is implicit or unconscious bias. And what it is, it's just a way for us to categorize other people really quickly without thinking. So it's that, I don't want to say gut feel, but gut feel is based off of our unconscious bias, the way that our brains work. So as we take in information around us, we take all of that information and then we make assumptions usually based off of that. But the information that we're taking in is our unconscious bias. And somebody, sent me a message and said, well, don't you mean subconscious bias? And I said, well, no, the terminology is unconscious bias. I didn't create it. That's what it's called, right? And so she starts to explain the difference between unconscious and subconscious. And I'm like, I get that. However, this is what it's called. If you don't like it, take it up with the scientific community, not me.
Interesting. And I also thought it was worth noting that you mentioned 150 different types or more of bias.
Yes. I mean, there's so, and people will know me. I'm very facetious. I joke a lot about this, right? And my thoughts are always, who sat around and came up with all the different types of bias, right? And literally counted, because then I've seen it's 150, 180, there's probably more. Many of them are very similar. And my outlook on that is, who cares if there's one or 100, right? The point of the matter is, what is the behavior? What is the action that we're doing? I don't care what you call it. I don't care how you define it. What I care about is how you treat me, how you treat my daughters, how you treat others when you interact with them. And that's what the concept is actually trying to get people to be aware of.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So when you get into your speaking engagements and your training sessions, again, I think you open people's minds up to something they really have never considered or really thought about. And are you seeing gains where you're able to go in and work with leadership, and are they taking what you're saying and are they implementing it? I mean, are you seeing change happen? I just think that's fascinating. And I hope the answer is yes.
The answer is yes, sometimes, right? Like you said, you go in, you start talking to people and explaining these concepts, and some people, they get it and they hear it, and they're open to taking that information in. And some people, they hear it and they see it as a challenge, right? To their authority, to their power, to, you know, their rules and regulations. And in some instances, at least the way that I do it, it is a bit of a challenge, right? Because we need to be challenged to think differently. Definition of crazy, right, is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different outcome. And yet these leaders want to keep doing the same thing over and over again. It's like we talk about the great resignation right now, right? Everyone's leaving their jobs, and for some reason employers are surprised by this. It's like, how are you surprised when we are in a situation where employees have not been happy for a long time? They've been treated and undervalued, right? And now that they have an opportunity to try something else or go someplace else, they're going to do it.
Yeah. So let's change gears a little bit and talk about bias in data specifically. And I think one of our goals that we're hoping to achieve is, will you love to be able to eradicate bias? But I think we now understand after just a few minutes with you prior, like we can't totally get rid of bias in data. So let's talk about, how does bias actually creep into our data? And I'll turn it up. Well, and before because Stacey, definitely want to hear your thoughts on this, but to kind of warm us up into the data part of this, Bill, why don't you talk about your thoughts on how bias enters into our data?
Yeah, sure. And what's funny is that bias in data it's sort of like I can't think of the right word for it. There are sort of two meanings of it, let's say. One is that we use that term a lot in data just to talk about normal data concerns, data quality concerns. People who are data analysts learn about like survivor bias and Simpson's paradox and all these other built-in biases we have with our data sets where, we look at the data, we expect this might be the answer, but it's really that. Or we're looking at the data, but the sample quality is bad because we only looked at the results that were a certain way and we forgot to look at the other results and get the results based on the mix of the two and blah, 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 blah. So there's that bias. And then there's the bias that we're talking about today, which, as Stacey said, is more about, how we treat people based on bias, how we treat groups and et cetera, et cetera. So even that word, is being used in sort of two different contexts, I guess. But bias appears, the kind that we're talking about today primarily, in every stage of the data process, right? Like when we collect data, there is bias in how we collect it, the questions that we ask, the types of people that we talk to, even the subjects that we study and that we choose to measure our biases are going to influence all of those things, right? Then when we go to come up with our hypotheses for why something has happened, that's going to be based on our bias. When we do the analysis, that's when the other type of bias creeps in, because we just make all kinds of mistakes based on our assumptions about the data. And then, not to mention, and we have talked about this a couple times before in this, these Data Fundamentals Unpacked sessions, the idea that, well, let's use machine learning and AI and all this other stuff, which we'll talk about later. And of course, bias is built into that as well. So, I before we came on, we were just chatting a little bit, and I said to Stacey, like, bias is like everywhere, and it's inevitable. It's like 100% like the most reliable thing there is almost on earth, right? Like, we all have biases, we all have our perspectives, and therefore we're constantly misjudging everything. And so therefore it's inevitable that there is bias baked into every little corner of the data universe. So it's everywhere and it's inevitable, and therefore, what do we do about it?
Yeah,
can I just do what?
Yeah, please jump in.
The two different types of bias, right? The second affects the first, right?
Yeah.
So that's really, you get all of those different types of data biases because of your personal biases, right? And as you said, in the collection, or the fact that you might be expecting a certain type of outcome and you get something else, well, that's because you had bias, right? If you didn't have bias, you wouldn't have an expectation of what the outcome would be before you got there, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
But that's really kind of hard. I think that's where I have the most challenges, because I mean, there's always some form of assumption. When I study data, there's some, like, I'm studying it and analyzing it because someone's made an assumption somewhere that I'm trying to either prove or disprove. And so I guess I struggle to understand, like, I guess I feel like sometimes when I hear about bias, I immediately believe it's a very negative thing. It seems negative to me. But then you're telling me that it's in everything. It's just really hard. Like, how do we deal with, if I have to make an assumption to test a hypothesis, like, how do I do that? I think I need somebody to help me unpack that. And I can't be the only one feeling that way, right?
I think one of the easiest ways to think about it personally is that let's forget about the human bias, my own personal biases. Let's try to abstract it and make it less judgmental, less about me and my poor failings, etc. Let's use a different example from science, because science, you have a hypothesis, you're going to test it, and you're going to see if you're right. You can have bias in there. Let's say I'm Isaac Newton and an apple falls from the tree. My assumption is that there's something pulling it. So I'm going to do all my testing and math and whatever, that there's got to be a force pulling it down. I never even considered the idea. It's just outside of my possibility, my realm of possibility, that it could be a force pushing it down from somewhere else. So all of my tests are about pulling, when in fact, it's more of a pushing. And so, I think that's a decent example to think about. It just is. You have these built-in assumptions, and they can be very dark and ugly and terrible, or they can be somewhat innocent, like that example. But either way, it's there. And so as long as you do your best to try to be aware of all the possibilities, then you can maybe do a better job of testing all the possibilities and proving your initial assumption wrong.
And to that point, I mean, right, being open to the fact that when you find out that, someone says, well, actually what's happened is it's being pulled down, right? That when you think that, well, it was, or, other way around, fine. You find out that it was something pushing down, right? And you say, no, my hypothesis is correct. It must be pulling. And you refuse to listen to this other data that's being shown to you, right? Like, there's a lot of that happening where there is absolute data that's giving you additional options, and you're discarding those other options because they don't fit into your hypothesis that you've come up with and your narrative.
A similar thing is how many times I've seen people want to treat as an outlier anything that doesn't support their conclusion.
Oh yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, all of that. If it's not where I knew we were going to begin with, here's these odd results. We don't need to keep these odd results.
So yeah, let's throw those out.
Yeah, because they just get in the way. They challenge what it was where we thought we were going.
Right. And that's
Yeah.
where you got to dig in, right? Like that's where you should be looking. It's like, wow, this information is here. It might be an outlier. Why did that happen? Let's see if we can replicate that and see why that might be happening. Let's dig, right?
So that part is easy for me to get my head around. Like, you thought it was going one way. You brought me in to study it. I've discovered that what you thought was happening is really not what's happening. And here's the truth. Like that part is no problem for me. I think it is a problem for people sometimes to absolutely accept, that they get laser focused on what they're hoping is going to be the outcome, what they've been preaching and saying is the outcome, and then to discover it's not. I'm a pretty blunt and straightforward person. I think probably my clients actually like that. They know if I see something, I'm going to come back and I'm not going to sugarcoat it or pretend like I didn't see it or eliminate records from the sample to, make it match what you hoped it was going to do. I'm never going to do that. So it's easy for me to do that. I actually had to walk away from a data project where the collection of their data sample or the data that they had was not representative of the whole. And I'm like, okay. And they were like, can we just study this? We'll just go with what we have. Like, well, we can't just go with what you have because we can't tell the truth. Like we can tell the truth of what you have, but we can't use what you have and paint a broad brush across the whole. And me and the other research scientists in there, but both agreed, like, we don't care what they show up with next. We're not touching this project because they're not using what we would consider as reliable, valid, and trusted methods. But I'm in a leadership role where I can walk away. I can make that decision. So what kind of advice do we have for our newer or less seasoned data people where they're not in a leadership role and they don't have the authority to just like pull the plug and say, I'm not showing up to do this today? Like what do we tell them? How do we help? And how do we empower them? Anybody got any thoughts on empowering non-leadership to deal with this at the workplace?
Well, I mean, I always have thoughts, right? But I think that there's two ways you can go about this, and this is what I tell people all the time. One is you can work within the system and attempt to create some kind of psychological safety, right? Where we're going to be able to and you have to do this up front. If you wait till the project has started and data starts to come in, and then you try to change things, it's too late. You cannot do things once the wheels have been set in motion. So understanding the kind of environment that you're in, you need to upfront, before anyone does anything, get a consensus from people that this is how we're going to operate. These are the rules we're going to work under, and these are the expectations that we're setting. And then you have a much better chance of somebody saying, oh yeah, of course, I'm open to this. Let's do it this way, right? Because then when there are anomalies or things that come up, you can say, hey, we all agreed, right? As a team, this is what we were going to do. But if you wait till you're in the middle of it and then try to make change, there's no point. All right. So then the other option is sometimes you really just have to leave, you know. I've worked with some companies where I feel really bad for the employees, and I've had people come to me and say, what do you think I should do? Do you think I should leave? And I tell people, I'm never going to advocate you quitting your job, right? However, the fact that you're asking me that question means you already have an idea of what you probably need to do.
Yeah, good point. Good point. So, Jenny, Bill, you have any thoughts on like what we can advise our non-seasoned data people on, not being in a authoritative role, not being in leadership, and how to, if you see something very obvious happening in a data project, like how can you safely, I mean, because even if you're in a place where people appear to be open, the minute you open your mouth to say something they're not prepared to hear, who knows what's going to happen. So like, how do we help, how do we help break it? How do we unpack it? I guess it's just really hard for me to imagine. My response is I'm going to walk away from this, but I know everybody doesn't have the luxury to do that. So are there things that they can do and say to at least help?
I mean, I think it's like anything. It is about, speaking up and pointing it out and hoping for the best. And then the only option may be to walk away. I mean, unfortunately, there is no great answer. And especially right now, right? Like this culture, this idea of, hey, bias goes a lot deeper and it's spread a lot further than we thought about 10, 15, 20 years ago. It's even in something like an AI research project. There are people getting on board and understanding this, and the momentum is growing, but it's still pretty darn early in that process. And I think the best example is, there's a woman who was an AI researcher at Google, a very prominent, like well-known person with a lot of credibility and credentials. And she pointed out to leadership within Google that they had a serious ethics problem in their AI research, and she got fired. And she went public about it, and it went bananas right after that. It just the media coverage and all the rest of it. And so she was a pretty senior person, and there were serious consequences for her, first speaking up. And she didn't speak up just once. I'm sure she sort of elevated it and elevated and elevated, trying to get people to pay attention because it was really important and serious. If you're more junior, you may not be able to escalate it all the way up to the C-suite, right? And so if you hit a wall, you hit a wall, and then you have to recognize, to Stacey's point, maybe that organization, that culture just isn't the best fit for you. There's no easy answer, I think.
Yeah, it's a tough one.
I have to believe that there is a competitive advantage being open to hearing what your employees have to say.
Oh, for real.
Right? Do you know what I mean?
Agreed.
And so over time, if people continue to raise issues and aren't heard and they leave, I have to, some part of me has to believe that company suffers in a way that that 5 years from now, we're going to see them on the wrong end of a news story.
Yeah.
Because they've lost their internal conscience. They've lost their internal voice because they won't listen. I actually worked as a consultant for a company when their culture changed from open and inviting to nobody will tell the boss what's wrong because he's punitive. Oof. And that was a ride from their stock at $50 a share to $33.60. So I believe, from my small limited experience, but also what I look at in the world, that there's a benefit to employees and consultants and everybody else working in places where our voices are truly heard, and where when we flag an issue, people take it seriously, regardless of where that issue gets raised and where it comes from, and that there's an advantage to companies to be that way. And hopefully over time that, we continue to sort of wash out the bad business practices, realizing that what's a bad practice right now is something that was totally acceptable practice 20 years ago, mm-hmm. 30 years ago, 40 years ago, whatever the little thing is. There's always somebody, right, who says, well, we did it that way when we started. But, but the inability to change and the inability to listen to people who work for you and consult for you, I think should have and does have natural consequences. And we're seeing some of those right now. Yeah. People are walking away from companies because why not? Everybody else is,
right. No, I mean, you're absolutely right. And I think there is also, this is why this is such a complicated conversation, because there's also hierarchies of who can do that, right? So it's going to be, even though you might be, entry-level individual contributor, this is where we get into the DEI work, right? There's then also, if you are a white male, you're going to be listened to a lot more than if you are a white female. And then if you're a Black male or a Black female or a Latino woman, and I know I'm going to hear people say, oh my goodness, we really have to make everything about race and gender. And it's like, no, we don't. It would be great not to, but we also can't be blind to what's actually happening in workplaces. And it's just, as an example, I literally went into a T-Mobile store yesterday to switch my phone because AT&T service is horrendous. And I finally said I need to stop giving them my money. So I moved to T-Mobile. I had a woman help me, a Black woman. And of course, because of the work I do, we got into a conversation and she was telling me about all the things that customers say to her when they come in, because I live in a predominantly white neighborhood and the T-Mobile is in a predominantly white neighborhood. And she just said, yeah, she's like, the things that people will say to me that they think is okay to say, like somebody actually walked in and got mad at her, but because she didn't give the answer that he wanted and told her to go back to Compton. And she's like, that's like the silliest thing ever. And I joked, I said, well, you should have said, I think the phrase you're looking for is go back to Africa. But of course, she's like, well, I can't say those things because I work here. And then you get the angry Black woman, right? So why do I say this? Because there's so many nuances and levels to what you can and can't do in a workplace, right? Depending upon who you are, depending upon what your role is, depending upon what level of power you have, and depending upon who's above you and willing to listen. And so all of those things are factors that we have to think about when getting ready to, essentially whistleblow, right? And I think that's probably a really good way to look at it, is that there are protections for whistleblowers. So if you can get your, whatever it is that's happening, if it's big enough, right, under that protection, then there might be a little bit more. But, as you said, Bill, you've got people from Google, right, who are getting fired. I mean, it's like, I don't know what to say. People suck sometimes.
Yeah, well, that's true. The world is full of people who, yeah. Well, okay. So, and we're talking about the more serious, detrimental, like for real serious outcomes. You start talking about like you might need to leave, you might need to be a whistleblower. Like those are some serious things, right? So I'm going to dial it back just a little bit. And then I want to lighten it up just a little bit because I think there are some things that we can do. Because, again, not every single data set you ever study is groundbreaking work going to solve world hunger. Sometimes you're just trying to highlight how great your product is. Okay. So for those types of scenarios, I often think about Bill in one of our previous episodes discussing asking questions in and around a hockey game. So let's take it to that example. Bill, you said you use that example quite often. So let's talk about how we can, help reduce bias in some of the questions that we ask as people who survey people and ask questions. So Bill, talk about that hockey example one more time. I love it.
Sure. And there's actually two good examples out of there. One about the questions you ask and one about just sort of sample quality generally. So I'm going to make this up. I'm going to pretend I was hired by the NHL to go find out how many people like hockey. So I had the brilliant idea to go to a hockey game and ask people, hey, do you like hockey? And I talked to 5 people coming out of the hockey game, and 100% of people like ice hockey. So that's the result I told the NHL. 100% of people all around the world love ice hockey. We're good. That's dumb. That's ridiculous. That's absurd. Of course not. Well, I asked 40 people. No, that doesn't solve it either, right? No, I asked 40 people within a mile of a hockey rink in Boston where, there's a lot of hockey. Oh, no, I asked 40 people in Brazil. Okay, maybe, but except now I'm getting like the opposite bias, right? So yeah, obviously who you talk to. And then the other example I give, and this one I give all the time, I do a lot of, training, a lot of corporate workshops and online courses and whatnot. And at the end, I have this one client where at the end of their courses, I always remind them like, hey, you're going to get an email with a survey. And what if the email said, tell us how awesome this course was? And the only choices were the best course in the history of the universe, the best course I've ever taken, a really fantastic course, or a pretty darn good course. Like, the question you ask in addition to the sample quality obviously is going to have a huge impact on the results you get and how reliable they are.
So how super awesome was this course? Super, super awesome. Awesome, 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 awesome. Just basically awesome. Like, I think there's a lot of that happens when people, and those are like, again, like obvious, like you can't ask that question. But I think if people like really go back and look at some of the questions they've asked, they could really dissect previous questions asked and see, did we introduce a bias when we asked that question? I think that's a really good place to start. Like, and then
Yeah.
also ask yourself, as the people that are a part of a team, have you had any discussion on your team about bias and the questions we ask? And are we introducing bias into those questions? I think if you haven't had those conversations, that might also be a good place to start. And that's also something easy to ask your leadership too, is, hey, can we consider getting some information and training on, what bias means and what it could mean to our data and to the way we perform our surveys or questions. So Jenny, you got any thoughts over there?
What I was thinking is how often we're locking in bias by our choice of sample or entire population. So if I want to know if my workplace is a good place for a wide range of people to work, I can ask every single person who works for me. But if that's a pretty homogeneous group of people, like everybody who was in my boss's fraternity, right, then I'm really not I'm getting an accurate picture for the employees who are there now. They're all very, very happy. They like the fact they get Wednesday afternoons off to golf. But to say that we're a great workplace for a wider range of people that isn't all people who look like my boss or look like me, that's another whole step. And organizations do that all the time. They mistake the sample that their employee pool is, or the sample that their membership pool or their customer pool is, for the world as a whole. And then because we know we have this great workplace, the fact that, for example, when we have people of color come and join our workforce, they don't stay as long. That isn't then about us, because we know we're a great workplace. It is because we surveyed and we got all kinds of information. We met our current employees' needs. And instead it becomes an indictment of the folks who just don't make it here. Right?
Yeah. Now that's a perfect example. And I mean, using survey data, we did this with a client. I mean, we do this with clients all the time, but this one stands out the most. Exactly that, Jenny. It was like, we did a survey. We surveyed the entire organization. And one of the questions we asked was, is this company a good place to work for women? And so they got, like 65%, or, it wasn't great. It was like maybe 70%. But they're like, okay, it's not bad. We're not failing. But then what we told them is we made sure that all of our surveys are cut by demographic, right? So we were able to now dial down, like, let's look and see who said yes to this. And when we looked and divided it men versus women, men, overwhelmingly, 80% of them said this was a great place to work for women. But only 30% of women said this was a great place to work for women. So that number, when we broke it out and showed that to the leadership, they were aghast. They were like, wait, what? And it's like, yes, this is what we're trying to say. If you just take the data as a whole and look at it, like you said, Jenny, we're patting ourselves on the back. Oh yeah, we're a great place to work. But if you ask the people who actually, might actually be affected, they're going to tell you the real information, and they realize, like, oh crap, we really have work to do here because women don't like it here.
Right.
Yeah, what's funny about that example too, or both of those examples, is there's actually multiple biases potentially going on there, right? Because you have, all right, we asked our employees how much they like it, to Ginny's point, and they love it. Great. We have 100 employees. We didn't even talk to the 900 employees who have left over the past 5 years. And so we're missing that complete perspective. Like, this turnover was a freaking disaster in this company, but the 100 people who are here love it. Yay, we're good, right? Not to mention,
good point,
with this people in the company, how much do you love the company? And the people who've been here for less than a year, they like it. It's pretty good. It's got a 3.5 out of 5. If you've been here 5 years, got a 4 out of 5. If you've been here for 10 years, people who've been here for 30 years, they freaking love this company. Oh, you know what my conclusion is? The longer you're here, the more you love it. It's a causal thing, right? No, that's survivorship bias. Actually, that's one of those other biases, right? Like, of course, the people who have been here forever love it. Obviously, they wouldn't be here anymore, right? So there's so many issues with that. And that's where we get back to almost like one of the first questions is, being open-minded about what you might actually be seeing in your data. And essentially, and the phrase I usually like to use when I'm talking about this with students is, to do data work, you better be paranoid. Like, you better assume everything you're doing is wrong. I've talked to the wrong people. I've asked the wrong questions. I've asked it in the wrong way. I've collected it wrong. I've coded the data wrong, and I'm interpreting it wrong. Because if you do that, then you're always second guessing everything you do, which can drive you, crazy. But it can also allow you to be like, okay, I think I might have made a mistake here. I'm going to test the opposite. And this sort of gets to your point, Robin, before. I've found this problem. Maybe I'm wrong. I'm not sure if I'm wrong. What do I do about it? How do I test it? Well, let me try to test the opposite hypothesis. And if I can't prove that, then all right, maybe this is right. Or maybe I find muddling results and now I don't know what to do, talk to a supervisor, whatever. But be paranoid. I mean, that's the best advice I can give, because if you're open-minded to all the things potentially going wrong, you're more likely to find the alternative, the truth, the whatever, and be open to it. To your point, Stacey, that, oh, maybe that is the truth. Maybe my truth is wrong. Maybe that is the actual truth.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a lot of interesting things here for any data professional, really. Is one, if your leadership is not a data fluent leadership and they're not data practitioners already, they just love to get data, they may look at data in whole sets. But I believe our job as analysts is to, okay, this is what the whole set says, but like, where does it deviate? Where does it change based on, okay, I mean, I hate to use the word slicer, but let me slice the data this way. Let me filter the data this way and see if the results remain the same. Back to Stacey's point earlier, like, if you look at the whole, say, oh, wow, 70%. When you look at the two different demographics, it's like one's 80, one's 30, and you can see how it kind of levels out. I think you should be doing that with all your data sets. I don't think there is any time where you shouldn't explore where the answer deviates from the whole data set. I just think that's so interesting to even think about. And then also, we talk a lot about questions and like having the appropriate question that you ask, but then something that you mentioned that I don't want our data people to miss is the timing and the audience. So to your point, well, what about the 900 people that left? Are you asking these questions on the exit interview, and are you asking it within a week of them leaving? If you're just asking the people that work there and you're totally not thinking about the other people who've left, even there's some learning value for all of our audience there. Like, think about not only the question, but the timing and who all's in the pool of people that are going to get asked. I think there's a lot of value to that.
Yeah. Definitely. I mean, and that's one of the things we actually do with our surveys is we ask for permission. We ask for exit interviews. We ask for as much HR data as we can get. And we do interviews as well to be able to spot check the data, so that we get data from the survey, we get data from the interviews that we do, and then we actually look to see, can we get permission to contact people who have left? And we've done it at companies where we've reached out and spoken to ex-employees and really been able to make sure that data is robust.
That's awesome. So one of the things that we were kind of back and forth and discussing, and again, I just really just trying to like mentally get my head around the fact that I watched this documentary a gazillion years ago, and I discovered it's a toothpaste ruined me, because there was like this little statement on the bottom of the toothpaste that said this toothpaste was like something by this group of like sounded really official type people that said this is the best toothpaste on earth and this is fantastic, all of these, whatever. And then I realized, wait a minute, those people were paid. They're not like a bunch of independent dentists who came together to tell me that this is the best toothpaste on earth. And learning that as a young person really just ruined me. Okay. So when I see these independent fact check these groups that are pushing products, I immediately remember that toothpaste example, and I become very, very cynical about what the real truth is. And then I was thinking through, like, every time we target demographics, are we not automatically introducing bias? So I just want to talk briefly, like, if an entrepreneur loves their product and they're going to push their product onto you, aren't they're biased, right? And how do we deal with that? And then, yeah, how do you, as a person who is the consumer of the information on the other side, how do you know to even look for the bias?
Well, can I just say,
like, a lot to unpack there.
I mean, but isn't there a difference between, and I would hope that the answer was yes to this, right? Because otherwise it's going to ruin me, right? But isn't there a difference between marketing and data, right? So when I see the 4 out of 5 dentists approved, there's no way that I believe that that's actual data. That is marketing, right? I don't care. You could, like you said, you could tell me that 4 out of 5 actual dentists approved. I'm like, that's wonderful. But I understand that that's not scientific, right? That's marketing. And so I feel like there is a difference somewhere in there. And so I don't know.
That makes me emotionally feel better. But if I saw that 4 out of 5, and I don't care, insert whatever comes next. When you tell me 4 out of 5 something, my literal Robin Hunt response is, how many people did you ask? Where did you ask them? Where is the sample? How big is the sample size? Where did you, I mean, I literally do. I mean, I am so cynical. It's ridiculous. I'm literally doing that.
That's my question, right? Because in response to your question is, how do we get, diversity in marketing, basically? And as I said, there's a very big difference between our example of, here's, is this organization a great place to work, right? And you want to ask the women, right? You want to ask everyone, but you also need to make sure that you have asked for demographic data so that women, men, ethnicity, right, race, sexual orientation. How did people respond to this? And then, like, that's a different thing than actually going out and saying, oh, well, I'm only going to ask, let's say, Hispanic people about this cola because I want to sell it to Hispanic people in this neighborhood. To me, that's a focus group, right?
Okay.
Because I'm planning to target this neighborhood. And in this neighborhood, demographically speaking, this is who lives here. So I'm going to ask the individuals who live here about this product, right? Okay. I'm not going to ask, to Bill's point, I'm not going to ask people in Brazil about hockey because I'm not selling them hockey tickets, right? I'm selling the people in Boston hockey tickets, so I'm going to ask them about hockey. So I think you also have to be very clear about what your goals are and what you are categorizing your data collection activities as.
Oh, that's good stuff.
Also, I would say, to your point about the audience and what the audience should do with that information, we've just circled back to bias again, because I would say, I remember seeing Trident chewing gum commercials when I was a kid, 4 out of 5 dentists, literally the same topic.
Right.
And when I was a kid, I thought that was science. I thought literally 4 out of 5, like 80% of dentists approved. Well, first of all, define approve. Does that mean, that's pretty good, we like that gum? Or does it mean we approve of it because it's good for your teeth? Or does it mean it's not going to ruin your teeth? Like, the interpretation of just that word, we could have a whole probably session on, right?
Or does it mean that my kids really enjoyed the 100 free packs you sent me?
Exactly.
Oh, right.
Yeah. And so, your own bias, I'm a kid, I'm innocent, I trust adults. My bias is that means something. I'm a data worker, I'm the most skeptical human on earth. Tell me about the sample size and the quality and da-da-da-da-da. Or I trust government, or I don't trust government. Like, I trust government is keeping on top of marketing people that they're not allowed to lie. No, I don't trust government. No one cares. Everything's chaos. And so your own biases are going to affect how you interpret that information. And so, we have to encourage people to be skeptical and maybe almost paranoid about these things so that we can appropriately understand what's marketing, what's science, and maybe just be able to differentiate between the two. Maybe that's the problem with different disinformation in today's world, is that if people are a little bit more literate about this stuff, they could know, okay, that's a complete lie, but it's cool. That's a complete lie, but that's not cool. This is okay. It's the truth, but I'm not sure what it means. And at least sort of judge things with a slightly more coherent lens, I guess.
But I think what helps there too is, diversity, right? It's why you have to have a group of individuals that are different from each other, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not because we want to, fill quotas or do anything. Like, it's like we actually need to have diversity because then we get into people saying, well, can't we just do diversity of thought? No, absolutely not. Because when you say diversity of thought, what happens is people say things like, and I heard someone say this, you can have 10 blonde-haired, blue-eyed men in a room and have diversity of thought. Well, of course you can, right? Because you could have somebody from Sweden and somebody from America and somebody from Brazil, and they've got some diversity of thought, but they all look the same. But there's the applicability or the possibility of assuring diversity every single time. If you want diversity of thought, you need diversity of people, because you're always going to get diversity of thought if you have diversity of people. You're not guaranteed to get diversity of thought if you are just looking for diversity of thought.
And Stacey, isn't diversity of thought in that example you give also much more likely to give us a groupthink bias than if you have actual diversity of people?
Right.
I mean, you look around and go, what are the other blonde white guys saying, right? And so I think that there's this self-reinforcement even, right, about pretending that you can have a wide amount of diversity of opinion, diversity of thought, when in fact everybody you have, we're back to what was in the same fraternity as my boss.
Right. And
Not to mention,
I'll just say this, like, not to pick on blonde white guys, right? Like, this happens with group of homogenous Black people, right? Latino people, gay people. It's just, once you have a homogenous group of people, you're already going to be thinking a certain way because you have experiences that are similar. So you have to get diversity of people to get diversity of thought.
That's interesting.
That's cool.
And also seems like common sense.
You'd think, but
yeah, to me, it's one of the challenges is the things that I read and see and hear and practice to me are common sense. But then you hear other people and you're like, what? How could you possibly think if you have a group of people who are exactly the same, you're going to have any type of input outside that you may need to hear? It's hard for me to get my head around how people think that's a good idea. And, I get it. Like, you want to build your team, you build your team any way you want to. That's fine. I don't really care. But like, if you're doing groundbreaking things and you really want to make a difference in this world, then you need to have what represents the world around you pushing that. Like, to me, it just seems like complete common sense. And I know that that's oversimplifying it. And I do realize and appreciate that it's an issue, but it's hard for me to understand why it is so hard for people to get it. And I know, Stacey, you have way more experience with that head on than me for sure. And yeah, I'm glad that you decided to tackle this in your career for all of us, because your efforts in that way help all of us, whether we're talking about data, the workplace, everyday life. I mean, I just think it's just such an important topic. Again, it gets deep quick and it's complicated and it's complex, but to just simplify it and make it practical, again, just look around you, look at the things that you're doing, and maybe just start questioning and asking yourself some serious questions about the stuff that you're working with. I don't know, how do we make this practical for people so that they are going to take it? Once you've opened their eyes up to what it means, and they start to recognize this bias in themselves, and they make a decision, which is part of this. You have to make a decision to explore this further in yourself. But once you're there, what are some practical things that we can share to help people pursue this and maybe ultimately make a better world for the people who come after us? Any thoughts?
I definitely have some, but I'll defer to Ginny and Bill first to see if they have any.
Bill?
I mean, I guess from a data standpoint, if we're going to be that practical, just in our narrow niche of the world, it's definitely, I think it's sort of what I said before. My biggest bit of advice is big picture. It's, be open and inclusive to everything, because the moment you narrow any perspective, you're more likely to be wrong, and you're more likely to miss the opportunity to see that other possibility. And so that's, more diversity of people, more diversity in your data, a broader set of questions, a number of questions, and broader perspectives in everything you're looking at. And obviously, we don't have 8,000 hours to devote to that dumb little survey review project that you're assigned that you have to deliver on Tuesday. So there's always a limit. There's not an endless rabbit hole, but the more you open up to possibilities, the more likely you're going to find more truth. And to Ginny's point earlier, the companies that do that are more likely to be successful because they're going to have better cultures and all the other things Ginny said. I would also argue they're more likely to be successful because in the end, they're going to have better data, right? Like, so, I'm going to try to sell hockey pucks in Brazil. Good luck. Maybe if my job is to promote hockey in Brazil, we'll eventually get there. Good, that's a different task. But if my boss said, go try to sell hockey pucks in Brazil, I'm not going to be very successful. And it's based on that bad data he got because he talked to 4 people in Brazil who happened to go to college in Minnesota. They happen to like hockey. It's like bad sample, bad data. I got the wrong results. But if we actually are paranoid about our survey, well, I asked 4 people in Brazil. They liked hockey, 100% of them. Maybe there's something wrong with that. I wonder if I should look into that again. I'm more likely to get the better data and maybe not try to sell hockey pucks in Brazil until I've convinced them to like hockey there. So long answer, but long story short, be open to everything. You're more likely to detect issues, therefore get better data, therefore better results.
4 out of 5 hockey pucks said they loved to be hockey pucks in Brazil.
Yes, I read that one. I can't remember where I saw that.
Ginny, do you have any thoughts on that?
I was just having this fantasy where Herb Brooks' family's reunion was in Brazil. And therefore, there were a lot of folks who loved Minnesota hockey. But
right.
That was like my mindset of how you get bad data. I think it's not a huge leap from what Bill just said about let's look at everything, and we're going to have the more diverse we are in terms of trying to build like a data analysis team, an IT department, the more diverse we are, the more likely we are to be successful, which to me then, there's our driver, right? Our driver is we'd like to be successful. Who don't we have on our team yet? Who's not here? I mean, to me, that's one of the questions that has been important to me in my work life and my volunteer work life is who's not here? Who are we making decisions for with not enough knowledge? And who's not here can be who's not here in the workplace, who's not here on our Zoom call. It can also be who's not here in our data. Who did we never consider? Who do we never think of? And by what right then do we think that we know how to market to them, how to attract them as employees? The sort of the whole set of things there. So I hope I'm a little more aggressive about asking that kind of question of who's not in this data set, who's not in our decision making, who's not on our board of directors, who's not in our leadership. Now, yeah. Stacey, you have a bunch of stuff to say, right?
Well, I mean, I think that what you just said, Ginny, is so key, is who is not in the room physically, right? Because in a lot of places, we are still very homogenous, right? So it's like, who's not in the room to actually even bring their experiences and their questions to this data set. But then, as you said, who was not in the survey, who's not in the data, who hasn't been contacted at all? Because I think we have a couple of things where people are consistently, like you said, making decisions for individuals when you have not even asked them if this would be helpful to them, if this would be something they would want, but somebody woke up somewhere and had a great idea that this was the way we should go about it and haven't really done the proper homework and the underlying research that's needed to make that a sound decision. And so I would say, don't make decisions in a vacuum. To Bill's point, if you've got some silly survey that you've got to do and it's due in 2 days, but just don't be the only one looking at it, right? Ask somebody, make a friend with another coworker in your office and say, hey, do you have 10 minutes? Could you look at this, right? Ask someone different than you, because in that moment, there are so many times when, and I'm just gonna, because I'm real and I'm gonna say it, but there are so many times when people will do something and I will immediately read it and look at it and go, some white person did this. If they had asked any person of color, this would not be happening right now. This would not have made it to the light of day. It wouldn't have made it to Walmart shelves. It wouldn't have like why are we doing this? Who said this was okay? Right? Who approved this crap? And how many times have we seen the marketing misses again and again and again, where we've had to have the apologies and the sob stories and the crocodile tears about it's never going to happen again. Well, it's never going to happen again unless, right, you actually do the thing you can do, which is run your data by somebody else, ask somebody else about these questions, check in with them and say, hey, what do you think? Does this look okay to you, right? It doesn't even have to be somebody in data, right? Usually, as Robin said, common sense. Some of these things are common sense, and to people with a different perspective and a different experience, they will immediately be able to spot some of those things and go, yeah, that's probably not the way you want to go. That's not the outcome you were looking
Are you
for.
sure you want to? Let's rethink this a little bit. Yeah.
Well, meanwhile, like that probably brings back the point that we talked about earlier about how senior you need to be to level that up. Because the moment you said, Daisy, Walmart shelves, and tell me if I'm wrong, I assume you're talking about the Juneteenth paper plates, like all the Juneteenth products that they were selling. And how many people are involved in that decision at Walmart to decide that they should sell that stuff? Is it 2 people, 2 white guys sitting in a room? Or is it like 800 people throughout that entire supply chain who decided that that's a good idea, got elevated, marketing got involved, communicate? Like 800 people minimum had to be involved in that decision. And there's no way there were not 80 of them who were like, holy crap, are you joking? Like, this has got to be a terrible idea. And so how did that not get elevated up and actually change the plan? That's an interesting case study.
And that's the thing with these companies, right? Because I've worked in these large behemoths of companies where somebody walks in and says, we're doing this. Does anyone have any questions?
Right. That's true.
No, I don't have any questions because you said we're doing this. What's the point, right?
Yeah.
Set the expectation. So that's where it goes back to what I said in the very beginning about psychological safety and being able to embed that into organizations. Leaders have to be willing. We do a lot of manager training on that you have to be willing to accept the feedback. So many people say, oh yeah, bring it to me. I'm interested. I'll take the feedback. But then you take the feedback and then you turn around and respond in a negative way. If you do that, what you've now taught everyone else on your team is you're not open to feedback.
Yeah.
You're never going to get feedback ever again.
Or you're going to only get the feedback that everybody knows you're willing to hear.
Right.
And then you're going to believe that you are getting feedback. And that is the worst. I want to pick up on one thing, you guys. This has been so great for me. I really appreciate everybody just having this conversation. And immediately when we talk about having representation in the room, I want to be very clear to the data leadership that may be listening here. When we say representation in the room, that and Stacey said this in case you missed it, it doesn't necessarily mean that everybody has to be equally trained data analyst, fully equipped. I mean, that would be great, but you can have a fully diverse room with lots of thought if you're just intentional about it. You just need to be intentional about it. So I think I want to make sure we're real clear that yes, it's great to have highly skilled data workers, very diverse in your team. But when you don't have that, it's not like you're out of luck. You can just reach out to people who are different from you, find experts in their field, and just talk to them. Like I just feel like you have to have an option if you're a small team and you don't have the ability to hire a multi-diverse team yet. What do? You learn, meet, network, and identify people that can come in and help you, but you have to be intentional about it. That's just my thought. Well, I think we're at an hour. This has been fantastic. Stacey, please come back and visit us again and bring us your profound wisdom. We need it. We've been looking forward to having you as a guest. And for those of you who have been commenting, I have not been able to see any comments due to the spree of spam at the beginning. So I hated that I couldn't highlight any comments. I've seen that there's a lot in there. I know Bill, Jenny, and Stacey and myself will all go back and take a look at those. We appreciate you all being here. And Stacey, again, thank you. Come back and visit us again. And
I'll just do one little plug, and that is if you have not watched the Unconscious Bias course, which is on the LinkedIn Learning platform, it was the #1 most watched course for 2021. So if you haven't watched it yet, hop onto LinkedIn Learning and check it out.
Yes,
and you can also find my book at unbiasedbook.com.
We love it. Yes, we'll drop all those links in as well. Definitely a must-watch course for sure. All right. Stacey, we'll see you next time. Bill and Jenny, I'll see you guys in August.
Thanks again.
Hi, everyone. Thank you.